Okay, so I'm going to get right into it and make sure that my audio is decent. It should be. Um, I don't know if the levels are actually too high here. Um, so yeah, I guess I'll bring the levels down a little bit because they might be a little too high. So hopefully they weren't too bad for the last couple of videos. But in any case, the second function. So the second function is normative. And like any norm, it is difficult to describe. It is unlikely that a person will find more than two words when he talks about his health if it is normal. Colors, epithets, images are found only when the need arises to list ailments. So it is with the second function. It is difficult to describe, and like good health, you don't feel it. If the first function is best compared to a hammer, then the second is a river. She is just as strong. But besides strength, it has qualities unknown to the first: breadth, richness, naturalness, and flexibility. The source of all these advantages lies in the fact that for the second, strength is coupled with processivity, i.e., it is a force charged with constant dialogue, constant interaction. Returning to the comparison of the first and the second, we can say that if the first is our gift to ourselves, then the second is our gift to others. Therefore, it is the second function that is the best side of a person. So you can see there kind of the others positive dichotomy coming through in contrast to the others negative dichotomy for the first function. However, processivity is not the monopoly of the second. A real monopoly, or its main sign, is action that is impeccably adequate to the situation, without excess and without scarcity, standard behavior. I remember the story of one film director about an actress who was forced to film 20 takes in one day, and each time tears came to her eyes exactly when needed, and there were as many of them as needed. Only the second emotion can act this way. The second function is extremely rich in shades and has enormous range. In order not to go far, I will give an example of the same second emotion. One researcher calculated that Tolstoy described 85 shades of eye expression and 97 shades of a smile. The ability to see and convey such wealth is not just observation, it is a special psychological attitude of the individual. Okay. Another property of the second function, due to processivity, its complete implementation is possible only if there is a partner, an audience. This property is difficult to observe, but one woman with the second emotion admitted to me that although life circumstances forced her to do so, she alone somehow did not even like to cry. So um, that's kind of interesting. Uh, yep. Okay. Not much more I could say about that. Let's continue. So you can see like the second function description is like two paragraphs. The first is quite long. The third, as we'll see, is the longest by far, and the fourth is also short, but maybe even longer than the second. The combination of strength and processivity of the second function endows it with such an unusually valuable quality as pity. Actually, pity is not a monopoly of the second, but one of the aspects of procession. The specificity of the second's pity lies precisely in the fact that it pities from the position of strength, confidence, and experience of the richly gifted side of human nature. Let's say there is nothing better for the sick, disabled, and elderly than to be under the care of the second physics. Her tireless compassion, constant care, precision, speed, and caution of movements are able to provide maximum comfort to any infirm person. Another characteristic feature of the second function is that it is fearless. Moreover, a person experiences a kind of pleasure by putting it to the test, often in dubious and even obviously uncomfortable situations. And this behavior is easy to explain. The second is not only strong, but also flexible, so blows to it do not hurt, but only provide direction for further improvement. So one of my classmates, being a holder of the second physics, was not lazy to travel to the other end of the city with the sole purpose of fighting. He often drove around not knowing whether he was going to hit him or not. The matter, of course, was not without bruises and bumps, but the benefits became obvious over time. Over time, he became a dashing pilot and Air Force colonel. So the translation is a little garbled there, but he had a classmate who was, a 2F type, second physics, and he would travel around the city trying to get into fights. And while he got like bruised and bumps, over time he became kind of like this, kind of courageous and dashing figure in a high position. So the second position, it kind of seeks out risky situations, unlike the first, which is protective. And by getting influence, the second has more of it has more room for growth, whereas the first really doesn't have much room for growth. Okay. So for the third function, I'll cut this part out because I'm just going to have a sippy sip. Okay. Third function. We have all failed in one way or another, Jules Renard used to say sadly. He said without realizing that he was thereby intuitively sensing the third function in himself and others. In its principles, the third function is almost no different from the second. It is also processional, even so to speak, super-processive. However, in its external manifestations, the third function is strikingly different from the second. The difference is due to the fact that the third is not a strength, but a weakness, our ulcer, a sore spot in the human psyche. In my opinion, the term complex, introduced into use by the Zurich School of Psychiatrists, with the help of which attempts were made to describe the third function, is not very successful. Much more precise is the term dynamic trauma, which was used by the remarkable psychiatrist Charcot, who was one of the first to feel that the human psyche is characterized by some kind of congenital defect. Criticism of the term complex, however, does not negate the important fact that there are many precise features in the characteristics of the third function that Carl Gustav Jung gave under the name complexes. He wrote, "Experience shows that complexes always contain something like a conflict, or at least are either its cause or consequence. In any case, complexes are characterized by signs of conflict, shock, upheaval, awkwardness, and incompatibility. These are the so-called sore points. In French, bêtes noires. The British in this regard mention skeletons in the cupboard, which you don't really want to remember and even less want to they were reminded of by others. Even less you want them to be reminded of by others, but who often in the most unpleasant way remind of themselves." Okay. Obviously, complexes represent a kind of inferiority in the broadest sense, and I must immediately note that a complex or the possession of a complex does not necessarily mean inferiority. This only means that there is something incompatible, unassimilable, perhaps even some kind of obstacle. But it is also an incentive to great aspirations and therefore, quite possibly, even a new opportunity for success. Consequently, complexes are, in this sense, literally the center or nodal point of mental life. One cannot do without them, because otherwise mental activity would come to a stagnation fraught with consequences. But they also mean the unfulfilled in the individual, the area where something cannot be overcome or mastered. Those, without a doubt. This is a weak point in any sense of the word. This nature of the complex largely illuminates the reason for its emergence. Obviously, it manifests itself as a result of a collision between the requirement for adaptation and a special property of the individual that is unsuitable in relation to this requirement. Thus, the complex becomes for us a diagnostically valuable symptom of individual disposition. If we condense everything Jung said and add a little of our own, we can say that the essence of the third function is as follows. It is a function that we ourselves consider vulnerable, defective, underdeveloped, in need of constant strengthening, self-development, and protection. Hence all the specific features of the third function. Okay, so you can compare that to the nature of the first function he gave earlier. You can see that this function is also vulnerable. it's protective, you could say. It's others negative. It fears, or it's against the influence of the other as opposed to the self. Okay? But it feels weakness, unlike the first. And it feels underdevelopment rather than the first is kind of like overconfidence, overdevelopment. Um, in need of constant strengthening. Okay, so there's a little bit of like kind of in self development. So that's a little bit similar to the second function. You can see the kind of like processing um, side of things there, and protection again. Okay, so the third is a double. Just as the entire order of functions is divided into top and bottom, as already mentioned, so the third function is divided and bifurcated. The feeling of weakness is combined in her with a feeling of enormous but unrealized potential. The third is a chained Prometheus, a titan whose psychological chains make him weak, defenseless, and vulnerable. So the third, I think, I don't know, maybe the fourth technically, but I think, well, the third and the fourth have the most room for growth. So that's kind of an important feature of the system, is that, like he said in the beginning, the first starts strong, but then kind of becomes brittle over time because there isn't, people don't invest in developing their first function because they already feel like it's completely sufficient and excessive. Whereas the second position does develop itself, but it has a little bit of confidence. So maybe it doesn't have as much room for development as the third. The third is really like this engine of potential growth, but it will never feel satisfied because it always feels this deficiency. And the fourth might even have the most potential for growth, but it's so difficult for it to, it's difficult for people to even try to develop the fourth position because it's so blind and irresponsible and exhausted and feeling like other people can and should and will take care of the problems for it. So, one of my friends, when asked to explain what her third emotion looks like, answered very precisely. Imagine that you are pregnant and the child is already asking to come out, but your pelvis is too narrow and its head gets stuck when you try to give birth. Although in this case we were talking about the third emotion, the image of a painful birth with the child stuck in the pelvis could not be more suitable for describing the third function in general. So, colorful analogy, but basically there's all this potential for growth, but there's a bottleneck because of this kind of self-doubt and fear involved in it. So it's painful. Okay. Vulnerability and heightened sensitivity are the main signs of the third function. Strikes against the third are experienced extremely painfully, and the scars from them remain almost for life. As a rule, the period of complete defenselessness of the third function, and especially frequent blows to it, occurs in childhood. It is children who are most often beaten, humiliated, insulted, and scolded. And if in childhood the third turns out to be not protected, but on the contrary, constantly vulnerable, then the circumstance refines the already refined third to the extreme. Fortunately, attacks in the third function occur extremely rarely, since it has a heightened sense of danger, which allows it to prevent an attack, and it is difficult to take by surprise. Let's say a person with third physics perceives the outside world extremely cautiously, and therefore he experiences injuries only in exceptional cases. Of course, the words world and trauma have a purely physical meaning. Okay. Not sure what he's getting at there. Okay. Yeah, okay. Perceives the outside world extreme. Okay. So in the case of third physics, the world and trauma are purely physical. Okay. Waiting for a blow to the third function is our main nightmare. The third logic is afraid of being accused of incompetence. The third physics is afraid of beatings. The third will is afraid of humiliation. The third emotion is hysterical. However, this nightmare rarely comes true, since the third is prone to hyperbolism and usually greatly exaggerates the real danger. Returning to the comparison of the third with the chained Prometheus, I will add that her defenselessness and vulnerability make her see in every crow flying past the Zeus, eagle. Okay, this is, the translation's a little garbled here, but to compare, returning to the comparison of the third with the chained Prometheus, I will add that the third's defenselessness and vulnerability make it see in every crow flying past the eagle sent by Zeus to peck its liver. So that's referring to the myth of Prometheus there. So it sees threats everywhere. What's the word? It sees there's lots of false positives for the third function. It sees danger where there isn't any. However, life is life, and sometimes, to continue the metaphor, Zeus's eagle actually flies. Here, willy-nilly, something has to be done. There are three ways out of a situation in which the threat of a strike against the third is real. Either the most thorough preparation in advance of the conflict, or transfer of the struggle to another level and function, or flight. To illustrate this point, consider the history of the strained relationship between President Reagan and the press. With third logic, Reagan reduced the number of press conferences to a minimum. When he couldn't get away from them, he agreed to talk to journalists only after long rehearsals. This is the first way out. Despite the preparation, the president still did not feel very comfortable at the press conference, and therefore often got rid of questions with jokes, anecdotes, instructive stories, i.e., tried to transfer communication from the logical sphere that frightened him into a painless emotional one. This is the second way out. And finally, escape. Being taken by surprise by journalists, Reagan simply pretended to be deaf. So that's interesting. And I don't know about, a lot of his typings I'm not sure of, but again, just kind of try to read between the lines and kind of gather what he's saying. The third, like no other function, is given the ability to experience the pain of others, feel it even more acutely than the object of empathy feels it. Tolstoy say, did not value the work of a scientist or musician at all, but through the prism of his third physics, he could not look at every man working in the field without tears. Although the man himself did not necessarily experience the torment that Tolstoy attributed to him, and in turn he himself could look with the compassion of the third logic at every person who reads, etc., and so on. Okay. So in other words, Tolstoy, he projects his fear of physical labor and the physical world on the man in the field, and perhaps the man in the field, if he's a third L, a third logic, he might project that feeling on people who read and are academics, which might bore him or otherwise disturb him. Pity and compassion are those properties that make the third function similar to the second. However, there's a feeling unknown to the second, but constantly accompanying the third. This is envy. It is identical to the feeling experienced by the sick in relation to the healthy. It combines the desire to rise to the level of envy and at the same time humiliate him. Here I will continue to illustrate the story of the third function with examples from Tolstoy's life. Third physics. Oh, excuse me, I keep yawning. This is how director Lev Surzhytsky described a walk around Moscow with Tolstoy. Tolstoy noticed two cuirassiers from a distance. Shining in the sun with copper armor, ring spurs, they walked in step as if both had grown together. Their faces also shone with the complacency of strength and youth. Tolstoy began to reproach them. What majestic stupidity! Absolute animals who are trained with a stick. But when the cuirassiers caught up with him, he stopped and, following them with a gentle glance, said with admiration, "How beautiful! The ancient Romans, huh? Lavushka, strength, beauty, oh my God! How good it is when a person is beautiful. Like fine, ... I hope the reader paid attention to the polarity of Tolstoy's assessments when it came to the layer of life, which Tolstoy himself, with his third physics, was vulnerable, and with which the oncoming cuirassiers were, I'm saying cuirassiers, but maybe I should just say cuirassiers. I forget what's the proper way to say that, to be honest. Were clearly endowed in abundance. First physics. It is typical of the third function. fig leaf reaction. This is how the first reaction can be called in a situation when the third function collides with the same function located above. A free, open, strong manifestation of what is wounded in oneself irritates a person, forces him to look for some kind of justification for his weakness, actively deny the significance and effectiveness of this layer of life, and behind this denial, as if behind a shield, hide the feeling of his own inferiority. This is how a fig leaf is born, with which a person usually walks throughout his life. The number of fig leaves corresponds to the number of third functions. This is to the number of third functions. This is irony for the third emotion, skepticism for the third logic, hypocrisy for the third physics, foolishness and hypocrisy for the third will. And so, by fig leaf, I think that's referring to like the image of Adam and Eve like covering themselves up with fig leaves to hide their nakedness. Sorry, I just had to take a drink again. Where was I? However, hiding your shame under a fig leaf in itself is far from a guarantee of peace. Vice versa. The more active the denial, the more irresistible the secret desire to realize oneself in this particular vulnerable area of life. Here it is enough to recall that the monk of Kiev Pechersk-Lavra, third physics, who fleeing from fornication, buried himself up to his neck in the ground. Thus, sometimes the struggle with the processionality of one's own third leads almost to self-destruction. In this regard, it becomes clear why we not only reject the third function, but also passionately love it. We can say that the third function is the main generator of love, and the choice in marriage is often determined by it. It is not for nothing that the great preacher of asceticism, Tolstoy, married a girl gifted with flesh in abundance, first physics. And until the end of her life, she could not understand how the combination of the monstrous hypocrisy of the Kreutzer Sonata with the powerful and tireless love fervor of her husband was explained. And this is exactly how it is explained. Third physics, and that's it. Okay. I'm still thinking my volume is too high, so I'll turn it down again a little bit. Marriage is not the only means by which a person tries to unchain and realize his third function. There are also chemicals for this, such as alcohol. It is for the sake of the third that we drink alcohol in company. Let me emphasize, specifically in companies, because the origins of drunkenness are diverse. Alcohol drunk in company has a miraculous property that allows you to forget about your shortcomings and freely and easily implement the third function. Hence the amazing metamorphoses that usually happen to drunks, metamorphoses similar to those that happen to the millionaire from the famous Charlie Chaplin film. A dry, reserved person, third emotion, becomes sensitive. Silent, the third logic, becomes a chatterbox. A misogynist, third physics, red tape. Modest, third will, becomes arrogant. Yeah, and I'm not sure, red tape, I'm not familiar with that metaphor, but I think it's like misogynist there, I think, means more, you can broaden it to kind of someone who's fearful of like, sexual intimacy or, kind of has a fearful view of women, perhaps, becomes more, licentious and sensual, I guess. Scissors, in the behavior of the third function under the influence of alcohol, sometimes acquire a curious, if not tragicomic, coloring. Again, scissors, I don't know what that means in this context. Could be a mistranslation. Here's a typical quote from a letter to the newspaper. Yura was tall, strong, handsome. He constantly carried me in his arms, and everything would have been fine if not for his oddities. He seemed to be afraid of falling in love, afraid of love. True, he had only to drink, and he began to speak tender words. Kissed him furiously. I had no intimacy with anyone before my marriage. And at those moments, I simply went crazy. I loved him so much that I was looking for an excuse to drink. As long as he was mine, only mine. In a sober state, Yura was different. I didn't know how to stir him up, make him loosen up. Obviously, the problem here was the third emotion. And here the fundamental disadvantage of alcohol is named from the point of view of the implementation of the third function, the short duration of its action. The next day, the problem returns with the addition of a headache. Very true. In the old days, in the old days of Russia, matchmakers going from house to house in search of a groom usually did not ask whether the groom drinks. Of course he drinks. They asked, how is he drunk? And this question seemed to be an extremely important psychological test, on the basis of which a pair corresponding to the third function was selected. And so that bit about alcohol, that's kind of a classic Afanasiev. He has this like, I mean, yeah, politically incorrect for sure. But it's like even more than that. It's like a deep sort of, it's something very different than you get from the more cleaned up and sterile typologies in, American literature, where it's kind of, I want to say like it's like juicy, and it's like juicy and like flippant, and he's willing to just make these kind of like, I don't know, bombastic like statements, and just to refer to like easy tricks to like understand typology in this very like simple way. And I kind of like it, and it's kind of like, yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe like that is the best way to test someone's third function, is just to like give them alcohol. But it's also, if you don't want to go that far and like kind of boil things down to these kind of very simple like methods of describing or understanding the theory, then you can at least understand it as an analogy. And again, like I've mentioned many times, just kind of like reading between the lines about it. So, I hope my voice doesn't go already. Like the second function, the third enjoys challenging itself. However, there are significant differences between self-testing of these two functions. Firstly, the third function prefers to test itself in conditions that exclude direct combat. And secondly, she goes to the limit in these tests. For example, Tolstoy's sister told how, at the age of 15, he ran 5 miles after a carriage, and when the carriage stopped, young Tolstoy was breathing so hard that his sister burst into tears. Only the third, and in particular the third physics, can examine itself in this way. Other physicists would have behaved differently. Effective physicists simply would not subject themselves to tests. First, due to self-confidence. Fourth, due to indifference. Second physicists would run after the carriage, but would run only as long as his competition is in pleasure. Okay. And so you can refer to his little story before about his buddy in university who would go out and, fight people on the other side of town as a way of testing himself. But again, however, there are significant differences. The third function prefers to test itself in conditions that exclude direct combat. So because the third is, fearful and it's self-conscious, it would hate to be in a competition where involving its aspect in which it's like bested, especially publicly. That would be the worst, to be like defeated publicly in a sphere regarding its aspect. That would be a blow. That would be a really big blow to it. But it will seek out these tests where there isn't a direct combatant and where people can't judge it. So that's a pretty good example for third physics. Another one for third physics might be, going out and just like hiking around, like hiking in the wilderness as, in order to like survive and to just learn how to, I don't know, navigate the wilderness, maybe go on like some sort of like solo backpacking thing where it's just, it's a challenge, but there's no one to like make fun of you or reprimand you. So that would be a good example. And I'm sure you could conjure other examples for the other functions or aspects. Okay. The test described above is typical of the third function, and what makes it so is the third's ignorance of the natural limits of its capabilities. Our internal picture of the state of the third function is a purely subjective matter, and in order to find out whether there is an ulcer according to the third or whether it only seems to us, and if there is, what its true dimensions are, it is necessary to examine the third and examine it to the limit of its capabilities. If the test for the third is passed successfully, then the highest satisfaction, unknown in other cases, occurs. In general, success, praise, and awards in the third function are valued like no other, and are a source of inescapable pride for their owner. So Napoleon, having the third logic, was most proud of his membership in the National Institute, Academy of Sciences, and even signed his orders for the army, Bonaparte, member of the National Institute, and only after this title he put all the rest, for others may be much more significant. So that's an illustrative example there. For the same reason, the third, like no other function, is sensitive to flattery. It is impossible to go through here, no matter how monstrous the flattery of the third may be, deep down in the soul, a person absolutely not believing it still shows complete readiness to drink this poison, never getting fed up or experiencing heartburn. Cool. So I'm going to take a sip again. Oh boy. All right. So the fourth function. It is difficult to speak at length about the fourth function. It is a trifle, a function to which we ourselves attach little importance. It does not follow from the above that the fourth is obviously weak and unproductive. On the contrary, the world is full of good mathematicians with the fourth logic and artists with the fourth emotion. The main thing in it, again, is the subjective hierarchy of internal values, forcing one thing in oneself to be placed in the last fourth level, and having placed it, treat it accordingly. So I think he goes into it more here. I would like to especially insist on this relation to the fourth function, since the confusion between the quality of functioning and the position of the function at the levels of the mental hierarchy is a common mistake in psychosophy. Fourth logic is not necessarily stupid, fourth emotion is not necessarily insensitive, etc. One woman with fourth will, when I once mentioned her weakness of character, objected to me with feeling, "That's not true, I'm not weak of character, it's just more convenient for me to be led." And she was absolutely right. God forbid that when examining low-value functions, we should identify their position with quality. There is no more serious mistake. And that's a good bit there. Again, just to summarize, these positions, as functions, as he calls them, are not about our capacity, our talent, our ability. It's not about like our IQ level. Our actual attractiveness, our actual physical capability, willpower, quality of our emotional expression, etc. This is about a self-perception of these realms, okay, and our orientations towards them. And I'm glad that he put that in there. And in fact, I'm reading this again. I had forgotten that he actually noted that. And it definitely softened my view of him, or of his way of putting psychosophy. So that's good. Externally, the fourth function is difficult to distinguish from the second. They are united by freedom, naturalness, and fearlessness of self-expression. So again, they're others positive, as Rob from Attitudinal Psyche would say. For example, the fourth logic costs nothing to get involved in a tricky philosophical debate, at the same time easily demonstrating the relaxedness and paradoxical nature of thinking, and does not even take offense, like the second logic, at the fool expressed in the hearts. However, despite the external similarity of action, there is a deep difference in motives between these two functions. Second logic will not be offended by a fool because it will not believe it, and fourth logic because assessments on this part are deeply indifferent to it. That's the trick. Okay. Based on the external similarity of the second and fourth functions, I see the need to list signs by which identification of the fourth can be considered unconditional. The main thing is that the activity according to the fourth does not have independent value. It is not a goal, but a means of existence. Therefore, if, say, someone with the fourth logic is engaged in the field of intellectual work, then it only follows that he is trying to use this function, regardless of success, as a tool with the help of which the requests of other valuable higher functions are realized, ambition according to will, material interests according to physics, etc. Secondly, the unreliability of what is mined and obtained according to the fourth. Let's remember the fourth logic of Tolstoy, who, with all his love for philosophizing, doubted the existence of Japan and Madagascar. Thirdly, shutting down the fourth in crisis situations. The human psyche, which is generally distrustful of the fourth as such, during crises turns it off as a possible obstacle to choosing the right decision and transfers internal energy to higher levels. Next is specularity. Interaction with the fourth is always identical to an order made by a higher function of the partner. This circumstance, for example, makes the fourth physics a good sexual partner, since without having its own model of sexual behavior, it adequately and sensitively responds to all the partner's requests. Finally, the fourth function is very dependent and easily entrusts itself to other functions that are higher in the hierarchy. Thus, the fourth physics painlessly becomes a kept woman. The fourth emotion is easily infected by other people's moods. The fourth logic accepts any more or less plausible concepts without dispute. The fourth will agrees in advance with the decisions made for it. A remarkable feature of the fourth is that a person recognizes its true power only in moments of fullness of life. Translating the term fullness of life into the language of psychosophy, we can say that this is the state when the first three functions are adequate to themselves, i.e., there is a good result for the first, and processes for the second and third are underway. It is at such moments that the usually dormant fourth function acquires strength, independence, and depth of sound, and vice versa. Strikes on any of the first three functions completely turn off the fourth. Okay, so it's the first to go. It's the first to be shut off at any sign of trouble. Okay. In a word, the fourth function is a slave without guile, a chameleon, and a dependent with great but often dormant potential. So I think, yeah, technically the fourth has the most growth potential, but it's more likely that I think people will develop their third function because of its fearfulness and its vulnerability. But the fourth technically has the most potential overall. Okay, so this is the last little bit for this video, and it's just going to go over this very useful table. And if you're not looking at if you're not watching this, if you're just listening to this, God bless your soul. I'll read off this table so you'll get the understanding of it. So at the end of the description of the functions, I will provide a diagram of their brief characteristics for clarity. So on the top, he has the first column is first, the second is second, third is third, fourth is fourth. And then he has a number of rows under each, so I'll go row by row. So you have for the first hammer, the second river, the third ulcer, and the fourth trifle. And so those are his nicknames, his colorful nicknames for kind of describing the nature of the functions. And I think this column at least is worth going over again. You know, the first function is like a hammer, right? It's like a blacksmith's hammer. A hammer is a tool, and it's rough, and it's also a weapon, like a war hammer, right? It smashes. It's impressive, and you might want to be fearful of it, but it's not something. It's hard to love the hammer, and it's easy to overdo it. Okay. The second is like a river, because it's strong. It has like depth and breadth, but it's winding, it's meandering, it's flowing. Okay, and it's water, so it seeks like an even distribution. It's normative. Okay. The third is ulcer, because an ulcer is painful. It's like something it's painful and you have to care for it and tend to it. The fourth is trifle, because it's not something you're indifferent to. It's something that seems annoying to focus on. You kind of want other people to take care of it. Okay. So then we have, going in order with the columns, we have result, process, process, result. So the first and fourth are the result positions or functions. The second and third are the process. And then we have excess, norm, flaw, and scarcity. So first is excess, second is norm, third is flaw, fourth is scarcity. Monologue, dialogue, dialogue, monologue. So the results positions are monologuing, and the second and third are dialoguing, dialogical. And I would add that the fourth position is kind of like monological in the sense that it feels free to kind of like spit out something that it's learned, but really it's monological in the sense that it will anticipate and welcome others' monologues, so other people feeding it information. Okay. In other words, the first and fourth, the results functions or positions, they're one-way streets. Okay. The second and third are equal exchanges, continuous exchanges. The first has the property of hardness. The second is flexible. The third is also flexible, and the fourth is hard. So again, it's the results versus process. The first is rigid. The second is pitying. The third is envious, and the fourth is indifferent. The first is cautious. The second it has fearlessness. The third is also cautious, but it's even more than cautious. It's timid. And the fourth also has fearlessness, like the second. The first has confidence. The second has confidence. The third has doubt. And the fourth is unreliable. Okay. The first has independence. The second has compromise. The third also has compromise. And the fourth has addiction. So that's the end of the table. So we have a diagram, and like any scheme, it suffers from straightforwardness and colorlessness. Therefore, our next task, well, I think he's being a little too hard on himself. I think that's a pretty useful table. Therefore, our next task is to complicate, enliven, and color the picture of the human psyche, giving a description of emotions, logic, physics, and will, depending on their position on the four-level hierarchy of internal values. So I'll end this video here, but what he's going to do now is he's going to start off with, he's going to go to, I think, emotion, logic, physics, and will. And for each one, he's going to start off with a general description of the aspect. And then he's going to go through in different sections and go first emotion, second emotion, third emotion, fourth emotion, etc., all the way through. So that'll be for the next video.